Designers and Builders, where design meets construction. We explore groundbreaking trends and talk to the pros reshaping our spaces. For your dream home, workspace, or just great design inspiration, subscribe to Designers and Builders.
Hey, welcome to today's brand new episode of Designers and Builders. I'm your host, Alyssa Olson, and today I'd like to welcome Roberto Rovira. How are you doing today, Roberto?
Doing good, Alyssa. How are you?
I'm great. Thanks so much for joining us. It's awesome to see you again. We connected not too long ago at the American Society of Landscape Architecture conference in New Orleans. So it's lovely to see you again on the screen this time.
Likewise. Great to
Ah,
reconnect.
for sure. So I understand, and I'd love to dive into your background. I know you have a background in mechanical engineering. You're a U.S. naval officer, professor and former chair at Florida International University, former president of the Landscape Architecture Foundation, all sorts of things that I had no idea about when we had chatted. Um, I would love to hear more about your backstory.
Yeah. Well, I think you got some of that list, and I kind of think of some of these things almost like past lives, I guess. But I did study engineering. I was in mechanical engineering undergrad, and then I did that with a Navy scholarship. So as soon as I graduated, I served as a U.S. Navy officer for 4 years, and and that experience, I think, seems like an odd contrast to landscape architecture, but in some ways, I've found in my experience, like we have wayward ways in which we get to the discipline of landscape architecture. And for me, it was this kind of love for the technical, but also this inability to let go of the humanities and the arts and this kind of more romantic side of things. So I always was fascinated with making things and figuring things out, and hence this sort of journey into engineering, which I did, which I studied, and then I actually was an engineering officer on board my ship, which was really intense and learned a ton there. But then once I finished, I always kind of viewed the experience of being in the service as a very formative period, which it definitely was. And but I thought that would be something that I would do. And then I have this romance with the ocean. I'm from Puerto Rico. I'm from an island, and I love the coast and the ocean. And so the Navy seemed like an interesting fit. But it also seemed like it was going to be a really challenging thing to do, and that drew me, I guess, in a way. And but once I finished my service, which was the last 3 years were in Japan, and the first year was, you know, very dreamy because I was invited to be the U.S. Navy's officer on a diplomatic role on a Chilean with the Chilean Navy, and they have this beautiful tall ship called the Esmeralda, and I got a call 2 months before graduating whether I wanted to do this and be the U.S. Navy's rep, and I thought about it for like 2 seconds, and I said, "Sign me up." So so I think I graduated on a Saturday. I got my uniform on Sunday, and Thursday I set sail across the Atlantic from North America, from Newport to England, France, Belgium, Spain, South Africa, and then back across to Brazil, Uruguay, Argentina, the Straits of Magellan, and Chile. And this wasn't like a quick trip. It was almost 6 or 7 months. And then I served in Japan, and I was there for 3 years, and mostly that was at sea also. And this was in the early '90s, so this was at the very end of Desert Storm and Desert Shield. It was a very, very intense period of time. So once I finished those 4 years, I felt, I had always kind of thought I'm thinking of doing something else, and it just so happened that when my time came up, I was in Australia and I detached from my ship. I spent time in Australia, and then we were heading to our second deployment, I think, and I found this company that sold tickets to the Trans-Siberian Railway in Hong Kong. This was one of the popular stops that we had, and the company was. This is before internet, before email, before cell phones, so This company was called Monkey Business. It turns out they were legit. They sold these tickets to the Trans-Siberian. So I hopped on this train from Hong Kong and across China, Mongolia, Russia. I had about 2 months to make it to Paris because I had applied to the Sorbonne. And my whole plan was after the service, I needed to find a way back into civilization. This is how I like to describe it because you're living quite an extreme, somewhat isolated life. Again, you're a little disconnected. So that was great. So did that trip, and in that trip, I met a landscape architect just by complete happenstance on a ferry, and he told me about what landscape was. It seemed like a threading of the needle between the technical and the poetic, and so I kind of filed that away. And after Paris, I came to the States. I applied to grad school, and I went to RISD, to Rhode Island School of Design, for my MLA, which was just a fantastic experience. So that's kind of how that went. So there's like this landscape, and that was I graduated in 1998. After that, I was hired by a company in California. I was in Northern California for 7 years. I worked 4 years in a small office. Then I started my own practice and did that for 4 more years, and then came to Miami. I was offered a teaching position where I am now at Florida International University, and I've been here since 2005, and I'm a faculty there. I just turned over 20 years of teaching here, so I've had a chance. I chaired the program for 8 years altogether, and practice all the entire way. So just kind of kept these parallel worlds, and so yeah, so it's kind of no joke. It seems like a former life, but it kind of got me ready. I think having traveled and seeing a lot of things, and just kind of falling in love with landscapes and cities and design, truly, and the arts throughout all that time.
That's incredible. I feel like that's the broadest range of experiences before discovering landscape architecture that I've heard to date, right? Traveling the world. Have you traveled back to some of those places since being in landscape architecture?
Uh, yeah, I mean, to be honest with you, like every place I go to, I always tell myself that I'm gonna be back. I sort of have this sort of confidence. Of course, that's probably impossible, but I have gone back. I've gone back to Japan a few times. I've gone back to the Middle East in a very different set of circumstances. Back when I was there in the Gulf, this we used to stop in the United Arab Emirates, in Dubai, in Abu Dhabi, in Bahrain, and I remember being out in these vast landscapes with the infrastructure of highways and the hotels and the souks, and but it was relatively, few and far between in terms of density and things like that. So of course, years later, I got a chance to actually work out there, and I traveled multiple times, and it's just this very dramatic shift in that landscape. So, but I try in Japan. I try to go to. I take students on study abroad trips. And that's always just wonderful to be able to do. And yeah, I mean, as much as I can, I try to do that and try to revisit and just kind of, it's inevitable. You just compare this fast pace of change, no matter where you are. It seems to happen very, very quickly, and most of these places are truly very, very transformed. Yeah.
Yeah. And is that something kind of that deeper history that you've experienced over the years? Is that integrated into your student experience when you're there?
Yeah, I mean, I think that like I feel that just travel period, I think is such an important part of designers development and maturity and growth, just the ability to see for oneself. I think that there's often this false sense that because we have access to so much information and imagery and sounds and just you know technology has enabled us to be in many places at one time. That simultaneity is deceiving because it's just the ability to walk on the analog one to one, as a designer, feel something, feel how much it weighs, how much it spans, how it feels different to walk on a certain surface versus another. Like that in itself is a huge education. Just simply by making yourself be in these places physically and seeing these things for yourself. So I always try to talk about that with my students, and actually some exercises that I do begin with, the usual uh, analysis that is done, like everybody, through Google Earth and GIS and all that. But then it's about flipping that, and they, in one example, I had them select random sites from an aerial in this general region where we were doing a studio, and I had them do these really in-depth analyses, and then they had to kind of walk the site and document it, found objects and tracings, and like really hands-on, and then just kind of put these things together, and that in itself is a revelation, so just that ability to be in a place and in space in three dimensions and a certain moment in time is absolutely a huge part of the way that I think, and sort of what I feel is an insight into a place that's just completely unreplaceable, from any technology.
Absolutely. Yeah, there's so many thoughts rushing through my head as you're saying that, but I think the first one I'm thinking about is just as creatives, the importance of taking all these inputs and synthesizing them, but also having them inform future creative outputs.
Hmm.
And thing I've been reading a lot about recently is neuroplasticity. And that's how your brain generates and grows. And I think it's through those tutorial experiences that you're describing is
Hmm.
exactly how we can become better as designers. And you
Hmm.
can't do that from not experiencing a place. All right.
Yeah,
So
and really the types of things that you do, when you almost have to have this attitude that, in our case, drawing or making things or modeling things is a way of accessing insights that are otherwise unseen. So, oftentimes, again, we have this ability to take amazing photographs in great detail, but the moment that you set out to sketch something or create some impression of it, it inevitably makes you have such a much deeper appreciation for its complexity or its logic even. So that is essential, not just being in the place, but also creating the situations that force you to think about that moment in time. And again, we have access to this training for sketching and observing, which is, I think, the beauty of our field, is when we become these observers that just that force those conditions that make us learn something very quickly that would otherwise we would walk past and not really appreciate or understand.
yeah, and I think just kind of translating those observations into a drawing or scene and realizing how these materials and have all these understandings kind of come together. I think something that stands out for me, and I'd love to hear you talk about more. It seems like one of your more impactful projects is your Sky Lounge project. And I
Yeah.
know there's a tactile quality with the glass that's no longer there, but was. And just the way that the materiality with the netting and the thousands of air plants came together.
Hmm.
I'd love to hear more about that.
Yeah, I think that project was definitely a very important one on many levels. This is a project in Miami at FIU and Florida International University, where I've taught now, like I said, for quite a while. It was in the second oldest building on campus. We're a very young campus. I think the university dates its founding plus or minus to like the early 70s, right? And so that's nothing. That's a blip on the screen for many older institutions. Nevertheless, it's a place that I think has this desire to really play an important role in our region in South Florida, and we are quite a force economically, and just in terms of the amount of folks that go through our programs. So there's a spirit of I think innovation that's built in, or entrepreneurial spirit, that I have really appreciated, and we always tend to punch above our weight. So the Sky Lounge was this opportunity to try and do that. And I got a call from the facilities VP and said, "Look, we have this courtyard, and we have a ton of students who use the space. There's about 13,000 students that walk through this or use it in any semester. There's offices there, and just to paint the picture, it's like the extravaganza of red mulch and a couple of concrete benches and just a very, very barren environment. And so they said, we want to do something there. And would you be interested in, designing it? And of course, I jumped on that. And it's a brutalist concrete building. 1974, I think, is when it was built. It has this very tall inside courtyard that's 4 stories. It's open to cross ventilation, so it's like open on all the sides. So you do have this uh, environment that's inside and outside. It has a brise soleil at the top, sunshade and precast as well. But it's this massive volume that's 4 stories tall. So everybody gets to see the space, its perimeter, looking into it, looking down. And that drama and that sort of the power of a space like that with the concrete everywhere was really an inspiring context. And so through the years, I've been really interested through installation work, contemporary installations in particular, of this contrast between heaviness and lightness or permanence and impermanence, dating back to my grad years. And so this was a chance to kind of test that out. So the space, what we ended up doing was basically floating 3 very tall, I think they're about 36-foot tall nets that are braided stainless steel. We have a ring at the top that's smaller than the ring at the bottom, so they flare out towards the ground. And the reason for that was we wanted to balance both the desire to make an impact in the space with the constraints of lightness. They have to be light because they're going to be hanging from the precast overhead. They have to create their presence, but they also shouldn't obstruct views through. And so that was kind of the initial idea, to have these hanging nets. And then on the ground, because it's a ground level and a lot of folks go through this building, whether they're going to that building or not, that ground plane had to be special. And so we created these custom made benches. One is faces in and the other one faces out. And they use the same profile. They're made out of powder coated aluminum. And so the same profile, but in some cases, they're kind of like the introverted bench and the extroverted bench. I like to think of it that way. And they don't do a full 360. They do 270. They face each other. So you have this implied rectangle that allows people to move through. The ground we designed to be recycled glass. And at the beginning, it was going to be porous paving, which it was. We used a PVC mat. We did loose glass. And that was very controversial, to be honest with you, because people say, what? Recycled glass, loose glass? That's impossible. This is it's going to be so dangerous. And so I actually had to take our CFO, our chief financial officer, who was overseeing the project, and had him take off his shoes with like one of the faculty senate reps and me, and we were barefoot walking on this and showing them tempered glass, barefoot, no problem. So they said, great, let's go ahead, let's do it. So we did that. But the space gets like, thousands of kids and faculty and staff who walk through it. So little by little, the glass started to migrate out of the space. And it's like, okay, we got to do something about this. And we tried to cast it in resin. And because of the PVC, it never quite set. So we had to scrap that whole idea, I forget, maybe a year later. And we ended up using a recycled glass tile. So today you go there, you see this blue, which was a really important part of the project. And it was important. The blue is significant because FIU is, they wanted to really brand the space with the university. And I wanted to do that sensitively. I didn't want to put a big sort of mascot logo anywhere. So I said, let's really double down on the blue. So that's where the blue came from. And so we did this recycled glass tile and you maintain that. And we use sky blue vine, which is a very, kind of blue, purple blooming plant that's very, very prolific down here. And then we use a ton of air plants on the nets. So you have these hanging nets. I purposely didn't anchor them on the ground because I wanted that little bit of cross ventilation makes them sway. So when you're underneath and you're sitting on these benches, the benches are circular, but they're almost like a lounge profile. So we actually prototyped it in PVC and plywood. And I joke that it's like the tallest bench in the world. It's like a 4-story bench because it's not just the small part, but it's the net above it. When you lie down on it and you look up, that's the bench. It's these two things together. And so that was kind of the idea. And then this little gentle sway when you're lying down, it's a really relaxing and contemplative space. And I've loved, because I work there for as long as I have the fortune of being able to go through and see how people use the space. And so
Mm.
I've seen it used by cello, somebody practicing the cello, the beautiful concerto, right? Like this guy just was there playing before the semester started, and he's in his own thing, and I'm like looking through the hanging nets, and it's just a beautiful moment. We had one of my kids is one of my sons is a huge skater, and he calls me very excitedly one day and says, "Oh, Dad, Thrasher magazine did a post, and they're showing the Sky Lounge benches, and some really famous skater like did this trick where he like swept around on it." So that was like really cool. And I've heard there's been like wedding proposals there. I haven't seen those in play, but I see people singing in the space, and it's a very versatile. It's very open. We left areas for people to arrange chairs for like lectures and stuff, and that's happened.
Mm.
But I always sort of that's kind of like something that I really appreciate about our field is we go in with these ideas, and at the end of the day, we really don't know how people are going to use it, or whether or not things will work the way that you intend. But it's always been a welcome surprise. So, and I find that project to be important on that level in terms of just innovating on what could have been a space where when I got the call, they got a SketchUp model from this idea for these two concrete fountains that to me looked like miniature versions of the building, and I said, "No, no, we can't have that." So, you know, so from that to taking a chance on doing a space that looks like nothing else on campus and using materials that were experimental and ideas like that. The installation was with like 20 or 30 volunteers. I had them come in, and we circled these nets, and with block and tackle, we hoisted them 6 feet at a time, tied another several hundred air plants on them, hoisted it again. So it was kind of like this Navy meets landscape architecture moment for me,
That's
sailing and land.
that's so cool. It's all of your worlds coming together spatially. But also, that just this blows my mind because you're taking a brutalist design building, which also my graduate school was in one of those, and I always found it kind of uninspiring, just the starkness of the concrete. But you really changed that, right? And brought life to it in that entire verticality of your biggest bench in the tallest bench in the world. And I'm curious with the steel netting, was that did you like prototype that or how did you figure that out?
We worked with, actually, this is another really interesting thing that often happens in projects like this. I developed a relationship with a manufacturer, Jacob Rope Systems. And Jacob, since that project, they've been huge fans. In fact, last couple of years ago, they were partners in one of the studios that I taught that looked at the studio was called The Machine in the Garden, and it looked at what would industries 2.0 that had sustainability and civic agendas and sort of like a complete shift on what is a typical industrial site. How would you approach that as a landscape architect if you wanted to do more than just produce? Like, how do you create spaces for environment and people, et cetera? And Jacob, because of that project, we had always kind of kept in touch, and I've done a variety of projects with them over the years. They actually were interested and they actually built this amazing factory in Vietnam that is also open to the elements, and it has these horizontal plantings that let natural circulation flow, primarily solar powered. So they're interested in these topics. So we worked with them. We worked with them for this project, and we obviously had it engineered. We wanted to make sure that it worked. Turns out every one of those nets is only about 200 pounds. So it really didn't tax the structure at all, but it creates a very large volume, a big impact. It holds the plants, and yet it doesn't sort of become anything that to be concerned about in terms of its structural needs. It's working with manufacturers, and then in this case, it's has been a really wonderful relationship with them over the years. And I continue to do projects with them. I've done some public art projects as well. We did these nets in a town called Lauderhill, north of Miami. That's an interesting project that they have a very large school on the east of the turnpike, and they have the kids who live on the west part of the turnpike. They have to cross, I think, one of the few overpasses in Florida. And it's a very, well, to be charitable, uninspiring transit that they have to go through. I call it the penitentiary aesthetic, chain link fence and concrete and just really terrible. And kids get used to get jumped a lot. But this is their daily routine. And so we ended up doing a project that first we attempted to actually design elements on the bridge itself. And, through materials, through lighting, through texture, through paint, we explored this. A great colleague of mine, Jacek Koleshinsky, and I, he's an artist, and I teamed up on this project. And we had all these wonderful ideas, and it's a project that had a jurisdiction of the school board, FDOT, Florida Department of Transportation, which I affectionately call the FDONT, the don't, because no matter what you propose, they say don't do that. Had FPL, the Florida Power and Light. So all these entities, were coming here with these great, oh, why not do this? And this is going to be great for this community and blah, blah, blah. And we got shot down. And at one point, they said, fine, yes, you can do what you want on the bridge and we'll let you paint it. But you have to agree, and the city commissioner that was spearheading the effort and was really a champion for us, he's at the meeting and they said, but you have to agree that every 8 years you have to paint this bridge again because that's what's required. And we're like, okay, that sounds like it's doable. And it says, and the commissioner asked, so, and how much is painting this bridge? It's like, well, it's about $300,000 to paint the bridge every 8 years. So he's like, okay, well, that's a non-starter. So we couldn't do anything to the bridge at the end of the day, not even light it. So we ended up doing these groupings of nets, also Jacob, that were bookends and would be aligned with the trajectory of the kids crossing this bridge. And we used about 250,000 zip ties on them to create these really colorful nets. And we did workshops with them. We had them do these maps on the ground with bright yarn that mapped out their trajectory from school to their auntie's house to their home. And so we created these very, very colorful patterns, and those patterns were the ones that we adapted on these nets. And then because it's school and the schools have all these protocols for having an enclosed perimeter, they have a big chain link fence, which was terrible, and that was right next to this project. And so we ended up also speaking with the principal, and they were part of the process, and they basically had their students come out and do patterns with the zip ties on the chain link fence. And then she committed to every year the graduating class would have an opportunity to re-put zip ties on the fence according to their pattern. So it became sort of, we created this infrastructure, with these tall, we call them, shade umbrellas. To be honest, the shade, it's nice, but it's not really that much shade either. But it's really striking with the colors, and then this activity that the kids do as part of their sort of experience of the place, where they get to add and put their signature on that. So that relationship with Jacob from the Sky Lounge led to this other one and led to the studio. So it's kind of like, again, this kind of really nice thread that tied all those.
Absolutely. And I think it's really cool too because it's not only the power of design, right? You had so many constraints that you
Yeah,
ended up doing this light touch thing, but it really speaks to the power of community and relationships. And now it's becoming this palimpsest over time, right? Like each of these next classes have this relationship with the space that's completely transformed. It's no longer the worst part of their day. It's actually
right.
something they can relate to every year to come.
Exactly. Yeah, they're proud to show it. They're proud to be a part of it. And it took a long time. I mean, we spent several years working on with that group. And they came to we took them to the museums. We did these workshops with them, and because part of it too is this importance of establishing trust, with the folks that are collaborating with you on these projects. And we started out with some ideas, but at the end of the day, I think it became better because we had this chance to really interact with them and have them tell us what they wanted to see, etc. So yeah.
Yeah, for sure. And I guess I'm curious, is that something do you kind of try to instill those lessons learned upon your students?
We do yeah, absolutely, a big effort to make sure that context has primacy, not only in terms of place, but also community and people. And in fact, our curriculum has a built-in sequence that includes a studio we call community studio that has that, even though what has happened is that I think a great majority of our studios are always reaching out and working with partners, and we want to make sure that we have the students understand the value of it. On the one hand, it's always a conversation about how can it be stronger. Are you creating the conditions that allow for that relationship to actually be constructive, or are you just going through the motions? And so that is a big part of the conversations that we have. It's like, how can you make sure that it isn't just uh, a moment for you to say, "Oh, we did all this outreach," and and then we ended up doing whatever we want, and like that that part, So how do you make that meaningful? And and it's kind of having a certain humility about approaching sites anyway, which I think is really important for designers to have. Anyway, how do you build that? We have this kind of tension, obviously, between the idea of historically design and the designer, and this kind of brilliant mind that's bestowing all these great things upon the population, and then there's this need for clear ideas and identity, but at the same time there's this other very essential respect for a place and respect for its patterns and respect for the communities that are part of it, where you will be a part of it briefly, and if you're responsible you'll come back and you'll continue that conversation, but oftentimes that doesn't happen. And so again, that's important for the education of any designer, and we put a lot of effort into making sure that we talk about that in my studios, definitely, and I know across the board and in our School of Architecture.
Yeah, that's really powerful because I feel like that's one of those, well, seemingly more and more now, a misconception about designers, but it's still there is that level of ego and just dissolving that. And I love it that it's at the academic level, right? Like people not even yet into their careers or earlier or wherever they're at in their careers, but just keeping that as the baseline so that you focus on those transformational qualities in the design process, in the relationship moving forward.
Yeah. I mean, and you do have it doesn't I think that it's a false dichotomy that you have to compromise good ideas and good vision when you take this approach where you recognize the importance of context and community. I think quite the opposite. I mean, if you are a good designer, then you know how to work with constraints, and that if you consider that to be a constraint, then you work in some way. But if you consider it as something that'll ultimately make you better, it's something that you should welcome.
Yeah, for sure. And I also, there's, you know, the concept of the tabula rasa, right? The blank slate. There are no
Right.
blanks ever. And the constraints make your design more powerful, similar to your brutalist building. Like it had to be see through and it had to do all these things and be spatially light. And it led you to this really cool weaving technique and partnering with Jacob, who I absolutely love for so many reasons. And it's just like it made it this really cool thing that's now a centralized feature, not only for the design building, but for the university, right?
Yeah. I mean, and I think the concept of the tabula rasa, which is one that I know any designer has heard and talked about this and considered it. It really, to me, it boils down to just if that is something like it's really just a matter of you're not observing enough. You're not stopping to observe enough. If you think that something is a blank slate, there's nothing here. It just means that you haven't looked deeply enough. And I think that a great design education, a good design education, is really understands the power and the essential sort of this basic, profound importance of being a good observer. I think that is something that if you get it right, then you can have designs that are always going to respond to, in elegant ways and in really sort of innovative ways. If you begin by being a good observer, and to be a good observer, then you have to take the time and you have to set yourself up for those moments where you learn to become a better observer and not operating under incorrect assumptions or incomplete assumptions.
Hmm. For sure. And I guess so. Just in thinking of that, of kind of balancing academia and the professional practice for you, are there other things you see like observation is critical? Like what else for you kind of informs between the two or carries across them?
I'm a big fan, and I think this also stems from the design education. And obviously, you're going through these projects that are, if you look at some of them and you were to take an academic project and actually implement it, we all know in the professional world that there's uh, so many factors that go well beyond design constraints and well beyond the conversation about good ideas from a design point of view. There's so many moments and so many players and so many factors that have to be taken into account, right? And that's just life. That's just part of how it goes. Which is why I feel that, I've always been drawn to doing work that is about, I love installations. I love temporary installations. I founded a group back at RISD, Guerrilla Gardens, back in the 90s, and we used to go throughout the city and we would do these anonymous things. One point, this one alley, when people throw out their Christmas trees, in New England, they're very organized and everybody throws out their Christmas trees like almost like on the same day, right? So, we're students and we had no money, and so we collected like over 100 of these trees, and then we jammed them in this one alleyway that had all these vents, and it was like really hard, very dramatic space, but we created like this evergreen forest overnight. And so everybody cut through these two buildings to go from, one place to the other. And suddenly like there's like these Christmas trees, like, this forest where you walk through, and the scent, and it was just really the sort of the phenomenology of these trees is just really wonderful. Made stronger from that juxtaposition of, right, you don't expect to have a forest overnight anywhere. But the public safety got all up in arms. They didn't know who I was. They eventually found out, but they went in a huff and they like took these trees and like took them like away. And I found out where their mulching yard was. And so we went like a day or two later and we got them all back and we put them back. But instead of putting them back in the same alley, we put them like a block away. And they were like that block away was like they were now like going up a set of stairs, you know? And so these trees are like this little forest that's suddenly now walking up the stairs. And then they got all up in arms again and like, oh, they took them away. They put them back in the same place. So we did this for like 2 weeks. And it became like the migrating forest, through the city, right? We did these really cool, almost like a Zen garden of birdseed, and in this like open field in the middle of like this part of in Providence, and it was really cool at the beginning. Like you see these really very perfect concentric circles of birdseed. We got I don't know how many hundreds of pounds of birdseed. And so, we were there, we document this thing. We did them all at night. And I used to like just do a poster that said Guerrilla Gardens tonight, meet at, X place at 10 o'clock. And we'd have the materials and a rough idea of what we were going to do. So we ended up doing these concentric, like this, like birdseed Zen garden. And then what was cool about that was that over the course of like, 2, 3 weeks, the seeds start disappearing because, the squirrels, the birds, they start eating it. And then what ended up happening is like the seeds were no longer visible, but you would have birds feeding in concentric circles, in the middle of the park, which was really amazing. And, we did all kinds of crazy stuff. We did stuff with like, we used to I got 300 feet of garden hose from a building spigot to this one park. And We did these frames out of like bronze screen mesh. It's a beautiful gauzy golden look. We ended up getting like a small grant, so we were able to afford some things. And that was when we got this like roll of like industrial size roll of of bronze screen mesh, which is a beautiful material. And then we hung it with like copper piping from these branches of these trees. And then we got these 300, I remember 300 linear feet of hose in midwinter, freezing cold. And we ran the water and we misted these things and they froze like immediately on impact, you know? And so now you had like these webs of ice hanging from these trees. We did stuff like the Providence meter maids were really efficient at giving tickets. And so for like one Valentine's Day, it was really difficult, but we finally found like the exact matching stock of this obnoxious fluorescent orange paper, and I scanned the Providence ticket. I don't, they're probably not like this anymore, but they were really obnoxious. And on one side, it had like this super bold thing that said violation, and then you flipped it over, and it had like all the details and all this money that you had to pay. So we printed like 1,500 traffic tickets in the same size, and in one side it has a perfect scan of the thing violation, on the other it said happy Valentine's Day from Guerrilla Gardens. And then we deployed an army and we had like these reams of tickets. We put them on like hundreds of cars, and then we documented people's reactions where they would look at this and they're in complete disbelief of where did this come from, and then they would pull it and then they would like laugh, you know. So anyway, like we used to do all those things. So long story, what I have appreciated over the years as a designer is that you have to, one, find humor. Obviously, I think that's a big part of it. Find humor in the work that you do. Don't take yourself too seriously. But also, I call it the Daniel Burnham 2.0. Like Daniel Burnham has this really famous quote that says, make no little plans because men won't listen to them, or whatever, whatever, right? This is the World's Fair planner. And I was like, no, the Daniel Burnham 2.0 is like, make thousands of little plans. Don't be afraid to do things that are going to move quickly, right? You know that you do an installation, you know it's going to be up, you remove it. Don't don't plan for the pyramids, you know, plan for something that's a constant sort of reimagining of things that show up and disappear and has some interesting shift in the grain of a site, for example. So I value that in the work, and I try to do that as much as possible in late years. And then I guess I describe always the period of time when I was doing the Guerrilla Gardens in Providence and then in California, more like you know, like the phase of my career that was about asking for forgiveness and not permission, right? As I as I have matured in terms of, you know, now, like, you know, I'm a professional landscape architect, I'm a professor, and I have 3 kids, and like it's a little different. There's more at stake, so I have to be a little more careful. So the nature of the installation work has shifted a little bit, and so I do these now. I do them, you know. I actually we were fortunate. We were able to get a property that's pretty big down in it's known as the Redland Agricultural District, south of Miami, on the way to the Keys, and I use it as a stage for just testing out ideas. I've done these giant like bird rookeries. I've done stuff with like fallen trees and all kinds of things like that. So in the end, you know, this is all in parallel, for which I have no time, for which I describe historically. I used to joke, you know, there's for-profit organizations, there's nonprofit, and there's the installation work falls into the negative profit, you know, but it's an investment, you know, it's an investment that pays its dividends in so many other ways. And if I can sort of bring that maybe back to the Sky Lounge in California, we did this installation in, I used to have my shop in Mare Island Naval Shipyard, which was a shipyard that closed in the early 90s. And I had this awesome little old Navy tool shed, which was next to the water, just an amazing place to work. We used to do full-scale installations and, you know, mock-ups and prototypes with my neighbor who was a metal worker. The other one was a glass artist. The other one was a painter. The other one was a woodworker. Like, we used to be able to play around and do these things. And but they have these gigantic dry docks. They're still there. They haven't moved. They're the oldest dry docks, I think, on the West Coast. and they're done out of salmon granite, beautiful material. They're massive. I want to say they're about 150 feet long. They're probably 30 feet deep, and they're wide and maybe another 60 feet or something like that. And dry docks, they have like a dam, a wall that keeps the level of the water high on one side and dry on the other. So they flood them, they open these doors, the ship comes in, they're pre-staged it with concrete blocks. The ship rests on these, they drain the water, they close the floodgates literally, and now they can work on the hull. This is a natural part of the process of maintaining a ship and this kind of in a marine environment. It closed, the base closed, the shipyard closed in the 90s. And so you have these incredible theaters that are just made of, massive, beautiful material, and they're empty and they're very dramatic. You go into them and you hear the slosh of water, in the distance. And so I thought, what a perfect place to do an installation. So we ended up getting like almost like 2.5 miles of yarn, like this deep blue yarn, like the deepest blue yarn that I could buy. And yarn is cheap, and so we strung about halfway up inside this dry dock for the entire length of the dry dock, about every 2 feet on center, the yarn lines. And these yarn lines would, you can't think of a stronger, more powerful juxtaposition between this carved stone dry dock with like gantry cranes, visible in the distance, and this like really ephemeral little yarn line there. But then you multiply that by 2.5 miles, and it's stringing its way at roughly the same height. And it created this effect almost like the water surface. And so that water surface inside the dry dock is close to the level of the water outside of it. And that was, an afternoon with like 3 people just throwing the yarn, stringing it, putting it back, and just weaving. I call it the dry dock loom. But we have this sense that in design, like you have to straddle this desire to control, right, and to have very precise methods of building things. But then landscape, I think, pushes back, and it's about this other looser, much less precise way that things grow, water moves, like there's this materially very different things, right? Our desire to control and impose our will on material, and then the way that it behaves on its own. And so to me, this was like this low tech way. And because the yarn is so light, it just moves, it just kind of
Yeah.
moved very lightly up and down in the space. And the fact that it was so imprecise, in fact, was its beauty. In fact, it was that quality that was on the opposite end of the spectrum of the dry dock. And just putting these two things together, it's similar to what the Sky Lounge tries to do, which is about brutalist concrete, but then these nets that are just there but not there, and just kind of moving a little bit back and forth. And it just kind of makes you really appreciate those extremes, both the heaviness, the gravitas of the material, but also the fact that you have this other very light thing that's kind of dancing on it and giving each other sort of this complementary meaning. Um, so I think that installation work is always maintained, for me, has been parallel to the other projects, we've done. We do parks, we've done work in Middle East, we've done work in the Caribbean, this cool park in Aruba, we've done stuff in Miami, and all that stuff is happening. But in a way, it's also, I try to allow it for it to be informed by these other experiments that don't have the exigencies of a client and the sort of expectations of a project and a set of deliverables. It's more about testing things out. I call it like sketching in 3 dimensions, just not really knowing where it's going to lead, but observing it and sort of appreciating it and allowing for it to kind of give back a little bit. And not only is it important from that level, but it's also important because generally projects take forever to do, like real projects just take so long. So this is a way to kind of keep that engine going and not being afraid. I don't know where, like, sometimes we'll build stuff and it'll fall down, and, fine, we just accept that and move on. But that's so important to be able to have, at least for me, it's been important to have that as as a counterpoint to the other work of teaching, to the other work of doing projects in a more traditional sense.
Yeah, that's wow. Just your level of curiosity and understanding of materiality and bringing that not only human scale, but the tactile quality, the softness to spaces, the softness to the cultural environment of the parking tickets, just like messing things up in beautiful ways that are ephemeral and really speak to the power of design, right? Even when it's really light touch, it can be really powerful.
Yeah, totally. And that's kind of the interesting thing is that sometimes we think that, oh, we don't have this giant budget or whatever, where it's like poor me, right? Like, well, honestly, just working within those constraints, I think allows us to find ways to work around those. And in the end, they're probably very revealing and very satisfying, what you can come up with if you don't have those resources that you might have in other places.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I love it. This is so inspiring. I feel like we have positively profited from your negative profits in all of your experience. So thank you for sharing that so much. Insights. Yeah, how can people best connect with you? How do we find you?
Uh, you can reach me at studio at robertorovira.com. You can look at our work and just, our website, robertorovira.com, which we're continuing to build and add to. And that's going to be the big effort this coming year because we have a lot of work that we need to update there. But yeah, reach out and Miami's a wonderful place and it's a great hub. So if you come through here, come by FIU or reach out. It's a really great place to see all the things that contribute to a great city, to a great natural environment, and these kind of crazy collisions between culture and place, and sometimes for good and sometimes in ways that make you pull your hair out. But yeah, really interesting.
Oh, great. Well, yeah, when you're packing your bag, bring some yarn and see what you can do.
Yeah,
So thank you so much. This is so inspiring. Have a great
of
rest of your
course. My pleasure, Lisha.
day. Take care.